Well, hello, my name is Eamonn O'Keeffe. I'm a historian and research fellow at the University of Cambridge, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this roundtable event here at the National Army Museum in the heart of London. This discussion is just one of a series of events and talks that the museum will be hosting to mark the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord and the beginning of the American War of Independence in April 1775. Now, the history of the American Revolution, of course, is inexorably linked to that of the British Army. Not only did the Army unsuccessfully campaign to prevent American independence, but men who'd fought for the British Crown in previous conflicts ended up serving the Patriot cause in the 1770s, including key generals like George Washington and the English-born Horatio Gates. And as this suggests, the Revolution was not only an anti-colonial rebellion and a crucible for a new American identity, but it was also a transatlantic conflict, which set neighbors and former compatriots against each other. Allegiances were questioned, contested, and formulated anew during these years. And the key question that we'll be answering today is, was the American War of Independence also a civil war? And to think about this issue, we've got a star team of historians here, a fantastic panel convened from both sides of the pond. And I'm pleased to welcome Professor Steve Pincus and David Armitage, as well as Dr. Megan King. Steve is the Thomas E. Donnelly Professor of History at the University of Chicago and the interim director of the Nicholson Center for British Studies. He is a historian of Britain and its empire, having written books on 17th and 18th century British history, including one on the origins of the American Declaration of Independence. David Armitage is the Lloyd C. Blankfein Professor of History, chair of the Committee on Degrees in Social Studies, and former chair of the Department of History at Harvard University. He teaches intellectual and international history and is the author or editor of 19 books, including The Declaration of Independence, A Global History. Megan King is an early career historian specializing in practices of civil resistance in revolutionary America. Megan is the project coordinator for the Age of Revolution Educational Legacy Project, which is supported by Waterloo 200 and based at the University of Kent. And she's also a manager at Benjamin Franklin's house here in London, the world's only remaining Franklin residence. It seems like demolition is almost as certain as death and taxes in Benjamin Franklin's case. So to start with, I'd like to ask our panelists for some thoughts on the core question for today's roundtable discussion. That is, should we be understanding the American War of Independence as a civil war? What are maybe the benefits of this view and possibly the drawbacks as well of seeing the conflict through this lens? David, if I could please start with you.
I think it's very useful indeed and very important historically to reconsider the War of Independence as a civil war. And I think that's for three reasons. I'm sure my fellow panelists will have others to add to these. The first is that it returns the War of Independence to its full British, transatlantic and imperial context by thinking of the commonalities on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed around the Atlantic that framed and shaped the course of the War of Independence. Secondly, it liberates the War of Independence from a nationalist teleology that was imposed back upon those events, particularly from the 19th century, making it an event in the history of the United States even before the United States existed. But more importantly, in this context, it restores the very deep divisions that characterize the war itself within North America, but also again within the British Empire and in Britain itself, and also reminds us of the often terrible violence that took place during the War of Independence, something that later nationalist accounts tended to gloss over. And thirdly and finally, I think it's historically important to rethink the War of Independence as a civil war, because those are exactly the terms that contemporaries use to describe it. For example, the very first declaration from the Second Continental Congress in July 1775, the Declaration on Taking Up Arms, said that the American cause was not to declare independence, but rather to save the empire from the calamities of civil war. And very similarly, the official British government response to the Declaration of Independence accused the Americans themselves of fomenting civil war. So these were the terms within which contemporaries understood the conflict, particularly before the Declaration of 1776 itself, and reminding ourselves now of those helps us to see dimensions of the war which later American, United Statesian accounts of the conflict itself tended to elide.
Thanks very much, David. Megan, do you have anything to add on this?
Sure. So I have a slightly different perspective. I definitely see the value in examining the American War of Independence as a civil war. But I think from my perspective, and perhaps because my research looks more closely at the precursors to war than it does at the physical struggle itself, I sometimes view certain characterizations of the American War of Independence as a bit of a generalization. I think certainly this was a prolonged internal conflict. It was deeply divisive, and it did pit subjects of the crown against each other in myriad ways. I mean, I'm currently sitting in Benjamin Franklin House right now, and this was a father who lost his relationship with his son, uh, his only living son, I should say, because of the disagreements over how they felt that the Anglo-American conflict could or should be resolved. So for sure, we can connect elements of the Revolutionary War to any other civil war, I think, from history. The American Civil War, which was similarly, deeply territorial and led friends and relatives to oppose each other on the battlefield. And I mean, H.W. Brands and other historians have beautifully and eloquently argued the extent to which patriots and loyalists fought against each other, not just physically, but also intellectually in newspapers and town hall meetings. Yeah, so I definitely see the value in this point. I think in particular, Brands emphasizes the significance of allegiance during the revolution, and I think that's the element that I find particularly compelling. But it's the factors that determined one's allegiance for me during this time that I feel make the American Revolution perhaps a bit more multifaceted than some other civil wars in history. So I think to call the American Revolution a civil war in some aspects can sort of detract from the truly revolutionary aspects of an almost 20-year process that enabled war. And yeah, I think it can sometimes minimize the roles played by myriad social, cultural, political, and ideological developments that grew and evolved during the imperial crisis.
Great, thank you, Megan. Steve, what's your view on seeing this conflict as a civil war?
Yeah, I mean, I also see it as a civil war, but I see it as part of an imperial civil war. And so my point, I mean, I guess the first point I would make is that I see this as a global conflict. The North America was only one of the scenes of conflicts. There was conflict in the Caribbean, also civil conflict in the Caribbean. There was civil conflict in Ireland. There was civil conflict in places that we don't normally think of as part of the revolution, like Nova Scotia. And there was civil conflict in India, which we've misleadingly called the First Anglo-Mysore War, but actually involved competing visions of what British governance in India. So my first point is that I think it was a civil war, and it becomes more clear as a civil war if one thinks about it on a global scale. The second thing is, by seeing it as an imperial civil war, we can place it in conversation with a global imperial crisis of the 17th and 18th century, a global imperial crisis which involved imperial breakdown in or imperial crisis in the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Ming Empire, leading to its downfall, but also obviously imperial crises in the French Empire and the Spanish Empire in the 1760s, 1770s, and 1780s. So putting the American Revolution in direct conversation, for example, with the Tupac Amaru revolt, it strikes me as extremely helpful. The third reason is just to echo something, I guess, that David said, is that I think it's important to try the American Revolutionary War away from nationalist and counter-nationalist narratives. And I suppose as an American, I'm particularly keen to avoid narratives that are both associated with the so-called 1776 projects and the so-called 1619 project. Both of them are nationalist narratives. They're counter-nationalist narratives, but I think that that the way to critique them is not internally within a nationalist paradigm, but to move beyond nationalist paradigms. And the fourth thing that I'll just simply say is that by seeing it as an imperial civil war, it allows us to think about partisanship within the British Empire on a global scale. And that's something that I see as absolutely important to recover.
Great. Thank you, Steve. We'll move on to the next question now, which is maybe for those of our listeners, our audience who are less familiar with the conflict, will help them set the scene and gain their bearings. That is simply just what caused this breach between Britain and the 13 colonies in North America. Maybe Megan, can we start with you, please?
Sure. Yeah, so as is the case with most political struggles, I think it's a bit tricky to pinpoint one specific event or issue and say that this is definitively what caused the breach between Britain and the American colonies. I think generally the narrative tends to center on the issue of taxation. And certainly growing up in Pennsylvania, I remember learning about Patrick Henry's infamous no taxation without representation line in primary school. So there's no denying really that the issue of taxation was a keystone feature in the colonial cause. But during the decade preceding the Declaration of Independence, a web of factors really contributed to these ever-increasing tensions between the colonies and their mother country. A big concern, I think, was the potential compromise of American autonomy, and colonists incrementally became more concerned about Parliament and its capacity to encroach further and further upon colonial agency in making determinations about how their legislatures operate, what is taxed and at what rates. So I think we kind of have to take a little step back and acknowledge that from the settlement period forward, American colonists had grown accustomed to enjoying certain benefits of belonging to the British Empire, be it trade or, military protection benefits, but without having British authorities specifically involved in the day-to-day of colonial affairs. So they were used to, at least to some degree, being able to handle their own business in some regards. And, when Britain started taxing the colonies in new revenue-raising ways, which, I'll just pinpoint the Stamp Act as one of the sort of first big ones, I guess, that was intended to raise revenue and offset the cost of the 7 Years' War. Some colonists sort of began to raise red flags, essentially. So a concern became, if we accept this duty or this tax and allow, this infringement or perceived infringement upon our liberties, what next? And that fear of losing agency of, if we compromise on this, then what, really starts to add steer to the colonial cause. And I think from these fears associated with taxation and with the loss of autonomy, patriot authors and printers and spokespeople from that point kind of worked to develop their legal and political, moral and economic understandings and ideas surrounding America's place, I guess, within the broader empire.
Great, thanks, Megan. David, can you give us a sense of your take on the origins of the American Revolution?
Yes, I mean, I build on what Megan said and also what Steve said in answer to the first question as well, that we have to pull out the focus here in order to understand on an imperial scale and a global scale what the both the long-term and the short-run factors were that caused the breach between Britain and only 13 of its colonies. There are different ways of enumerating the number of colonies that Britain had on the western side of the Atlantic in this period, 26, 29, 32, we have to remember that only a numerical minority actually broke away. And I think we'll come back to some of the reasons why there was that internal division among the colonies on the western side of the Atlantic, as well as the the bonding together of the 13 colonies that declared their independence. I think the overall way to think about this is, again, not in the terms of the nationalist narrative, which effectively tells the story of the American Revolution as a crisis of disintegration, as it were, proto-Americans discovering their own identity, attach themselves to a certain set of values, which then they put into practice against the predatory invasions of ministry, parliament, and the crown. We should think of it in fact in exactly the opposite way, as a crisis of integration. By the 1760s and 1770s, most of the white colonists in the 13 colonies, and indeed the other British colonies on the western side of the Atlantic, thought of themselves as more British in their mores, in their attachment to common law, in the way in which they organized property relations, but also in the ways in which they were, for example, bound together by the fruits of a modernizing consumer revolution which had transformed the British Atlantic world since the 1730s and 1740s. They were more alike together among the colonists, but also more alike between the colonists and the other side of the Atlantic as well. And to throw into that sense of integration, a sense of disintegration coming from the long-run consequences of imperial reform brought on by in particular, the fiscal effects of the 7 Years' War. A moment of great victory, another moment of integration and common celebration after 1763, cross-cut by the fiscal costs of that particular moment. Steve's reminded us of global imperial crises and reforms. Even just looking at the European empires in the Atlantic, the 1760s and 1770s were a moment of common imperial reform, not just for Britain, but also for Spain, the Bourbon reforms, and also for Portugal, the Pombaline reforms as well. This is a moment when all of the European empires in the Atlantic world are reconsidering their foundations and their relations, and really to understand the nature of what we think of now as the American crisis demands that wider Atlantic vision, but also, again, the global vision as well. We cannot begin to understand what happened in the mid-1770s without factoring in the Bengal famine of the early 1770s, the impact of that on the revenues of the East India Company, the pressure of the East India Company upon Parliament, leading, of course, to the importation of East India Company tea into American ports in the 13 colonies and the flashpoints that brought together. That's just one example of the way in which we must see the causal change as extending entirely globally in an area of imperial reform, meeting a remarkably integrated, in terms of identity and cultural forms, a remarkably integrated empire, which nonetheless provided the tinder for the events that we'll go into in more detail in a few minutes.
Great, thank you. And Steve, can I ask for your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. I mean, I guess I would sort of echo a lot of what's been said. I think it's important to realize and take seriously what George Washington said when he received a copy of the Declaration of Independence when he was in New York looking across at the British troops disembarking on Staten Island. He said he waved the Declaration of Independence in front of the troops and said, "See, we are defending the British Constitution," which is a remarkable thing. So the Americans think that they're defending the British Constitution, and I think the point is, and the point which one has to understand is the way that Americans dated the beginning of the crisis. Both in the Declaration of Independence and in John Adams' thoughts on government, they dated the beginning of the crisis to the accession of George III. Why did they do so? Well, they made it pretty clear because in their view, George III had altered imperial political economic priorities, had shifted from thinking about the most dynamic part of the British economy, which were in fact the colonies, not just the 13 colonies, but the 26, 29, however many you want to say, but British colonial possessions as the most dynamic part of the economy. And as a result of the fiscal pressures that David illuminated, as a result result of the 7 Years' War, there was a very hot debate right across the British Empire about how to deal with the fiscal pressures, the fact that there was a huge debt run up by the 7 Years' War, how to pay it down, and the alternatives that were discussed in some ways seem very familiar. One possibility was austerity, and to ratchet to cut down expenses, and to ratchet up taxes on colonists in a variety of ways to extract revenue. The other possibility was to sort of recognize that the colonies were the most dynamic part of the economy, and to provide subsidies so that there would be significant economic growth in all of the colonies that would generate customs revenue, which would in turn pay down the debt. So this was the debate which was started in the 1760s. It's George III and his former tutor, Lord Bute, advised austerity and taxing the colonies against the position that was being defended by the then ministers, the Duke of Newcastle and William Pitt the Elder. And that set the terms of the debate from the 1760s and 1770s onwards. That it's important to realize that this was a global debate. This was exactly the debate which led to huge amount of dissidence in the East India Company, in which there was a huge debate between Robert Clive and his faction that wanted to gain the Diwani, to tax directly the new provinces of Bengal, or the new province of Bengal, and others within the East India Company, like Lawrence Sullivan, who said, no. The idea is this is these new territories are the most advanced manufacturing places in the world. What we should do is not tax them, but benefit from the exports of their calicos to gain huge profits and to therefore pay down the national debt. So the same debate was taking place in India and about North America. And what one sees is the sort of growing tension from the victory of those who wanted austerity and colonial extraction, from Bute to Grenville to Lord North going forward, and a ratcheting up of a variety of levels of taxes, of which in a variety of ways. And, to my mind, it was the effects of these could be seen both in India and in North America, right? I mean, the Bengal famine was a direct result of a kind of militarization of Bengal, which then had knock-on effects, as David said, on what was going to happen in North America. So the origins of the American Revolution, to me, lie in a shift of British political economic priorities from trying to promote the development and growth of Britain's colonies, and especially the sort of North American colonies of consumption, to an extractive set of policies, which led to the cry of no taxation without representation. Interestingly, the same cry was being heard in Ireland in the 1770s, which led ultimately to the development of the volunteers and the Declaration of Irish Free Trade in 1778.
All right, great. Well, we'll come on to that later, this sort of wider story of Ireland and some of the British colonies that remained, under the crown and didn't break for the American Revolution later on. But I wanted to, I think, given what we've just heard about the sense that American patriots see themselves as defending the values of the British Constitution and are very proud British American citizens in the run-up to the Revolutionary War. David, I'd like to start with you, and can you walk us through, please, how something that begins as a campaign about protecting British liberties and is framed within the language of British liberties and staying within the British Empire, but on more advantageous terms, eventually becomes into a more radical struggle for a total break, a rejection of the empire, and a rejection of the crown. How did the colonists get from one stage to the next?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important exactly to frame it in the way that you did it there, Eamonn, that is that there was no preconceived scheme for independence, and even up into the late spring, early summer of 1776, there were relatively few public and vocal proponents of independence. Of course, the most famous by that point was Thomas Paine, publishing Common Sense in February of 1776. However, the apprehension or the speculation that there was such a campaign for independence really from 1775, perhaps even earlier than that, was part of the competing conspiracy theories which grew up on both sides. This is an analysis of the ideological temper of the American Revolution on both sides of the Atlantic that we associate with the late great historian Bernard Bailyn, to whom I owe a great debt, and I know that Steve does as well. But it's an analysis which holds up remarkably well in understanding how both sides came to misunderstand each other's intentions, and how from misunderstanding intentions created ever greater tensions, which led to the emergence of an independentist ideology, when one side, let's say the British side, imagined that Puritans and rebels were hell-bent on declaring their independence long before anyone actually in the colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America had done so. On the other hand, of course, in their public pronouncements, the Continental Congress and indeed other parts of the empire, Jamaica and Quebec, for instance, published their apprehension that what they saw going on in the movements, particularly from Parliament, but also ministerial and royal pronouncements, was a determined design for tyranny over the colonies themselves. Now, we, looking at those from afar, may see them as hysterical inventions, but they were animating, and they made sense of many different disparate actions on the part of actors on both sides of the Atlantic for accelerating and inflaming the cause, both in Britain itself, but also, as has been mentioned, in imitator parts of the empire in Ireland, for instance. These conspiracy theories really come to a head in the 13 colonies that are going to declare their independence, in a movement that we might say initially is one for protecting autonomy. But protecting autonomy within the empire, not outside the empire. From 1774 and particularly into 1775, there are far more efforts to reimagine the British Atlantic Empire on federal terms, for instance, most famously in Thomas Jefferson's Summary View of the British Empire in America, rethinking the colonies themselves as having a status similar to Scotland or Ireland within the composite monarchy of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and ultimately Ireland itself. The whole project, therefore, can be rethought in terms that historians of the Spanish world have rethought the early 19th century, quotes, independence movements, that is, not as determined movements for independence, but as ultimate outcomes of multiple efforts to reimagine the distribution of sovereignty within empire, rebalancing it and redistributing it among and between the colonies and the metropole, without any teleological assumption that independence was going to be the outcome. So to come back indeed to Steve's quotation from George Washington, when Washington is assembling his troops on Cambridge Common in the early summer of 1776, he's still running up a Union flag, a British Union flag. Even in the Declaration of Independence itself, there are still the words describing those on the other side of the conflict, literally and spatially, but also politically, as British brethren. This is also part of that framework of thinking of this as a civil war among people who recognize themselves as being citizens of the same political community, and that even in the Declaration of Independence, imagining this within a common Britishness, of course, appealing to the terms of British law, English common law in particular, means that even at the moment of declaring independence, there are still these deep ties which even the most public proponents of independence at that point have not been able to break. So in this sense, independence comes at the moment when militarily, politically, and economically, it seems to be essential for a majority of members of the Second Continental Congress to transform a civil war within the British Empire into an international war outside the British Empire with the assistance of the other powers of the earth, particularly France, but then from France, then to the Netherlands and to Spain, to Morocco, and to other powers as well. I'm sure we'll come on to that larger international context also.
Great, thank you. Steve, can I ask for your thoughts on the road to independence?
Yeah, I mean, I have a similar view. I mean, I would just sort of call one's attention to the 1774 Fairfax Resolves, which complained about, all of the things which are sort of familiar in the sort of narrative of the run-up to the American Revolution. That is to say, complained about the Townsend duties, complained about the Stamp Act, and the conclusion was that, the Imperial Parliament had been legislating badly, but that what they hoped was to persuade them that they had been making a mistake, and for a closer set of arrangements with Britain, which I think also hinted towards what David was sort of gesturing towards, and which obviously comes out in Jefferson's summary view. A notion of a federal empire, and I think they were drawing on a longer tradition, which had been contemplated on both sides of the Atlantic just before the outbreak of the 7 Years' War. That is to say, the Albany Plan. But there was also a similar British plan, which also involved quite a generous notion of reimagining the empire as a federal polity. And what's interesting about the British plan, and the plan which actually Benjamin Franklin commented positively upon, was that plan imagined the king as a neutral arbiter among the various parts of the Federation. And I think what's really telling is the move from 1774, the Fairfax Resolves, or indeed the 1772 Jamaica Petition, which also complained about very, very similar sorts of things, blamed Parliament and left the supposition that George III was not to blame, right? I mean, that this wasn't, whereas, of course, the complaints in the Declaration of Independence are about all of the things that George III did. And I think what's really important to see this shift from a desire for British liberties to a desire for independence is to see the shift from the possibility of imagining the king as a neutral arbiter of an imperial federation to suggesting, no, actually King George III was not the king of the British Empire, but was acting as an English king, and defending the rights of the English landowning classes, or perhaps the English Tory party. And I think that move is really important in the perceptions of Americans, but also in the perceptions of people right across the empire, which made this an imperial civil war. So that is to say that there was a broad set of complaints about policy from the 1760s and 1770s. It became a constitutional crisis, and indeed an imperial civil war, where there seemed to be no way within the Constitution to resolve that crisis. And that involved no longer seeing the king as a potential neutral arbiter. So I think what's really important is to see 1774 Fairfax Resolves blaming Parliament for bad policies, imagining that the king would support them in their calls for reform. 1776 in the Declaration of Independence saying George III was to blame for these bad policies.
Yes, I mean, I think that's one of the fascinating aspects of the early story of the American Revolution, where there's an attempt to look to the king and appeal to the king as the savior, as the person who can put Parliament in its place. But then when the king spurns those advances, then we see a shift to a condemnation of the king and a move towards a republic that very vituperatively rejects monarchy in no uncertain terms in the Declaration. Megan, last word to you. Give us a sense of how colonists are sort of dealing with this shift from seeing the king as a benign and helpful figure to someone who is actually responsible for many of the grievances that they feel they are laboring under.
It's really interesting, again, especially being in this house, and thinking sort of about Benjamin Franklin's experience with the Wedderburn affair and his sort of dressing down that happened in the cockpit, and kind of shifted him, who was seen as quite a pragmatic person, from having this sense of we need to do anything within our power to repair our relationship with Britain and figure out, some feasible, agreeable way that works for everyone here involved. From shifting from that to, okay, maybe it is sort of time to think about militarizing and becoming, taking a more active approach to mobilization. But yeah, I was interested in David's comment about the intention, because I think working in sort of a public history role, we often get folks, in the museums who ask, oh, at what point did folks push for independence? Was it something that was as early as the Stamp Act or the Townshend duties? And by and large, people are really surprised to learn that it was quite far down the road, actually, that independence wasn't seen as a totally dirty word. I think the evolution from relying on sort of lower intensity methods of resistance like petitioning or marching, was really truly incremental. And I mean, historians have estimated that even during the war years, something like 15 to 20% of the white population in the colonies remained loyalist. So the American Revolution wasn't a fully united front. And those who did shift and become more open to the idea of independence, or even full-on advocates for it, it was quite a gradual process. Folks really did cherish their connection to Britain. And I think as well, like for almost a decade, colonists are working to challenge imperial authority through the appropriate channels, like Steve was saying. And this produced some really key outcomes. I think this slow but steady resistance campaign allowed Americans not only to shore up their arguments against imperial interference at colonial affairs, but also to develop their own de facto governmental institutions. Localized committees of correspondence, which were sort of, I guess to break it down, were established in part to organize, but also to quell colonial protests to some degree. And yeah, the folks who headed those committees, whether it was a Samuel Adams or a John Dickinson, they quite fluidly sort of became seen as leaders in their own right. And, after years of working through these initiatives, they became the people that ordinary American colonists looked to for guidance to help them understand these broader moral and economic concerns surrounding the conflict. And I think, as both of these gentlemen have already said, in doing things sort of the right or perceived right way, challenging imperial authority through these channels, the push for independence and the ultimate shift towards militarization almost became more conscionable, more justified to some degree. So yeah, I think to put it plainly, sort of the spokespeople of the revolution were able to point to these steps that that they had taken, saying, we've tried A, B, and C. Parliament hasn't budged. Yeah, King George III at some point doesn't care. So realistically, by the time we get to the infamous shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the colonies were really only dependent on Britain in name. They had their ideological grounds, they had some infrastructure set up already. So yeah, I think it was a very sort of slow and steady thing, but whether it was intentional at some extent, or I guess at some point down the road or not, feasibly, independence could not have happened until around the point it did, because there just wasn't, the structures in place to allow that.
That's an interesting point about how important all those steps leading up to the mid-1770s crisis are in telling this story of making the breach sort of thinkable and therefore possible. I think I wanted to shift the focus now to think about the other side of the Atlantic, Britain, because this tends to be seen as a sort of Britain versus America war, but in many ways the American war was pretty divisive within Britain. There were plenty of individuals, of groups who thought that a coercive policy, that using force against the Americans was not the right approach. It was misguided or doomed to fail. And I just want to understand, I want to help the audience understand why in Britain this was such a divisive war, and the support for the ministry's policies, support for government policy was by no means universal. Steve, can you start us off with explaining why this was kind of in many ways a sort of a very tense period in Britain as well as on the other side of the Atlantic?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to sort of start with thinking about the sort of political economic interests, right? I mean, um, the Americas, the American colonies, but especially the North American colonies, including Nova Scotia, including Canada, were the most dynamic consumers of British manufactured goods. In the later from the 1760s onwards, and this meant that manufacturing interests in Britain, and one has to sort of realize that while we now know there's all these sort of lively debates among economic historians about when exactly the Industrial Revolution took place, but British manufacturing output was growing dramatically over the course of the 18th century, with or without machines. That is to say, some of it had to do with some development of engines. Some of it had to do just with the division of labor, as Adam Smith said. But there was huge growth of output at the same time that Britain's European rivals were closing down markets on Europe. So Britain was increasingly dependent on American consumers, which meant that for manufacturing interests, and interestingly at this point, there was a large degree of alignment between the manufacturers and their workers, depended on American consumption of those goods for their livelihood. So each step, the Stamp Act, the Townsend duties, all of these things which made it more difficult for British Americans to buy British manufactured goods, led to huge petitioning campaigns within Britain against these things. So the Stamp Act was extremely divisive, which explains why the fall of the Grenville ministry within Britain, that is to say, it was opposition within Britain rather than North American opposition, which led in the first instance to the fall of the Grenville ministry and the repeal of the Stamp Act. For example, all of these things had constituencies within Britain. And when I say within Britain, I don't just mean within England. It also involved a sort of growing linen manufacturers in both Ireland and in Scotland. All of these people had an interest in not ratcheting up the taxes on the colonies, and which led to significant opposition to the policies that were being pursued by the Grenville Ministry, the North Ministry, etc. On the other hand, there was a sort of landed interest within the British Isles, which felt that they had shouldered the burdens of the 7 Years' War, thought that the colonists were relatively undertaxed, and thought that the only way to pay down the debt was, yes, austerity measures, but the austerity measures involved getting rid of the bounties to North America. So one of the important things is that the North America and the North American colonies were substantially supported by bounties from the British Treasury to develop various elements of the North American economy. And we tend to underestimate that because those bounties did not come directly from the British Treasury. They came directly out of customs revenue in North America, and then were folded back in to developing, for example, the development of tar in the Carolinas. Now, with the accession of the George Grenville's ministry in 1763, he cut all of that off. Which led to significant and stop spending money on repairing harbors, on infrastructural development in North America. That obviously decreased the amount of consumption available, which is why it upset the manufacturing interests. But it did also mean that money could be folded back into Britain, would allow the sort of further lowering of the land tax. So Grenville's policies benefited the landed interest. So there were deep divisions in Britain before the American Revolution. And once the outbreak of hostilities began, that was simply accentuated. And we see that being manifested in the development, for example, of the calls for parliamentary reform. What's sort of forgotten is that the Yorkshire Association, the reason why they said parliamentary reform was necessary was because of the misguided policies with respect to America, right? So in other words, it was unequal representation in Britain, that the landed interests were overrepresented versus as vis-a-vis the manufacturing interests, which led to calls for parliamentary reform. And it's important to realize that the Gordon riots, which we normally see as this kind of vituperative anti-Catholic thing, at the heart, and most commentators knew on both sides, knew was actually an internal fight within Britain, which might have resulted in civil war, about the policies which led to the American Revolution. I mean, that's the commentary. I mean, I was just reading Lord Thurlow's commentary this morning on the riots themselves, and he says, look, at the heart, this is about most people in London, or at least the middling sort and the lower classes in London, being sympathetic with the Americans and therefore supporting Gordon's rights, not because they were concerned about giving more rights to Catholics, but this was just a pretext for a larger thing. So my point is that it was a deeply divided Britain. It was a deeply divided Britain over imperial policy because it affected everyday life for most people, because what happened either, I mean, ratcheting up the taxes on the colonists either made life better for people who lived off the land, or it made life harder for those associated with manufacturing, and that meant that this was very divisive in Britain itself. And it's important to realize that when the war ended, David Hartley said this actually might be better. And one of the people who negotiated the Treaty of Paris said this might actually be better for manufacturing interests in Britain, because the Americans will buy more British manufactured goods and therefore become more dependent on Britain. And that's in fact what happened, right? I mean, there was a huge increase in the consumption of British manufactured goods at the end of the American Revolution over what it had ever been before.
Great. Well, thank you. There's some great economic perspectives in there to think about. Megan, if I can come to you, I'd like to know more about people in Britain who sympathized with the American cause.
To be honest, I feel like Steve kind of touched on all of my points. I sort of approached it from the economic side as well, and really looked at Britain's strong dependence on American consumption. I mean, I think, yeah, it's kind of an interesting contradiction where you do have some folks saying, oh no, Americans do need to pay if they want to be treated as, equal parts of the empire and qualify essentially as Englishmen, then they need to find these ways to make contributions. On the American side, obviously, you've got folks saying, well, we already settled the colonies at our own expense. We traveled to these inhospitable deserts. That is our contribution. So yeah, I mean, I think just to sort of echo Steve, which I think he put incredibly well, to a degree, I guess it does come down to perspective, but I think the divisiveness that we see is a product of pre-existing conditions which were already in place that then became kind of amplified and magnified by the war.
Great. Thanks, Megan. I'd like to ask, David, if you could fill us in a bit more. What are some of the background reasons that there is this opposition within Britain to ministerial policies? There'd been an opposition, a radical sort of perspective in Britain for a long time, and this then aligns with the American cause. Why did the radicals within Britain see the American cause as attractive? Does it feed into the concerns that they already have?
Absolutely, and this is really just building on what both Megan and Steve have said already. That to that political economic context that Steve sketched in so beautifully for us, we should add urbanization as well, alongside industrialization. However we think of those forms of manufacture, that's creating larger agglomerations of populations who see themselves as being underrepresented in an unreformed parliament. That feeds into pre-existing but accelerating campaigns for parliamentary reform, which are themselves intersecting with the first calls for parliamentary suffrage in this period as well. Steve has already talked about the Yorkshire Association, the response to the Gordon riots. We can think about the prominence of political entrepreneurs like John Wilkes, for instance, who are very adept at tying together the concerns emerging across the Atlantic in the course of the imperial crisis from the 1760s onwards to concerns within England and more more broadly within Britain itself, and Wilkes becomes a major figure in the colonies, precisely as a kind of cynosure of resistance there as well. So there's a perfect feedback loop between those concerns there, which are then simply amplified, I think, particularly within Britain, though this is also relevant to the ideological context for the colonies, going all the way back to the attachment of Britons, the common attachment of Britons as Britons to what they saw as their peculiar inheritance of civil liberty guaranteed by the revolutionary settlement of 1688 to 1689. So as well as expanding our geographical range to see the American crisis in a global context, we also need to pull out the temporal context and take it all the way back to 1688-89 to see how debates about civil liberty, the definitions of those, how they're related to conceptions of consent, of representation, of parliament, of parliamentary exactions, particularly in a context where, for instance, as we've known for at least a generation now, British people within Britain itself, were taxed at higher rates than most of their contemporaries in Europe, far higher than in France, for instance, during this period, and that only gets worse as a result of the debt burden of the 7 Years' War itself, so a very ambivalent sense of victory. If we pull out the focus in a slightly different direction, just remembering how anxious the various ministries were about the fact of Britain's diplomatic isolation. This was the first major war, major global war and imperial war, which Britain fought without major continental allies, apart from a small percentage of Hessian mercenaries, for instance. So this is a period of genuine crisis in ministerial councils, in the relationship between parliament and people, and in the ideological elaboration of some fundamentally British values which are seen to be fundamentally British, counter to those, for example, of alleged continental despotisms or tyrannies on the one hand, but also as values which need to be sharpened in the context of a crisis sparked by the colonies, but then that tinder sets off a set of imitative demands in Britain itself. Also remember, this is not only the moment of the first calls for parliamentary suffrage and the reorganization of parliamentary representation, but we're also in the heart of the abolitionist movement as well. Another movement for freedom, for liberation, for reconsidering not only political economy, but also conceptions of human liberty. And all of these movements are being accelerated by the massive expansion of print and the deliberate use of print as an enormously effective weapon on both sides of the Atlantic in all of these political disputes as well. So it's a perfervid matrix for the recasting and the reimagining of fundamental conceptions of liberty on a local, a national, an imperial, and a global scale. That is the larger context here.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Now, I think we'll return to Megan for the next question, which is, having looked at Britons who echoed or sympathized with American concerns, I want to think about those who stuck with the crown on the American side of the Atlantic. Tell me, who identified as a loyalist in the American colonies? How many of them were there? And why did they choose not to throw their lot in with the revolution?
Sure. So, yeah, historians have kind of estimated that somewhere between 15 and 20% of the white population remained loyal to Britain despite the start of the physical conflict. And I think by and large, many of those folks were people who were sort of conservative by nature. They valued tradition. They maybe were opposed to big, radical, sort of earth-shattering change. So we're seeing here, members of the Anglican clergy, some Quakers or members of other pacifist groups who could not align themselves under any circumstances with the violence of war. There were also some landowners in there, large landowners, who sort of feared that with the construction of a new nation, we might see, the redistribution of land to some extent. I think predominantly, you did have loyalist strongholds in New York, in parts of the South. Pennsylvania certainly had its fair share of loyalists. But yeah, it was kind of a mixed bag. And in addition to that, there were some enslaved people who hoped that by aligning themselves with the English or the British cause, I should say, they would be guaranteed their freedom. So yeah, I think it was very much sort of a personal choice, and you had to sort of examine where your interests were vested and make that determination then.
Great, thanks, Megan. David, can you give us a sense, why would someone choose to be a loyalist?
Multiple different motivations for that. I think I from my reading of the literature on this would actually push the numbers a little higher than those that Megan gave. I think most historians of loyalism now would say it's somewhere between 20 and 33%. The 33%, of course, largely depending on John Adams's famous calculation that 1/3 were loyalists, one third were neutral, and 1/3 were patriots. That seems a rather stark and perhaps a higher estimate than most would now give, but maybe 20% rather than 15, I think is somewhere comfortably closer to most current estimates. And it would indeed be exactly the kind of motivations that Megan's already described. Other historians very convincingly have said, well, there are different groups of people with different view, who would call themselves Americans, but with different attachments to ideas of America. Some of the loyalists are very loyal to the idea of an America or American colonies within a federal conception of the British Empire. We would call them loyalists. They are the ones who would tend to remain, sometimes to remarry after the American Revolution, have a continuity across the breach, rather than those who are loyalist in the sense of, say, the Anglican ministers, who would attach themselves very specifically through oaths or declarations to the Crown or the Church of England, for instance. There are those black loyalists who Megan's mentioned already. I think the number we would tend to put on those at the moment is about 8,000 who specifically crossed British lines to join British forces during the conflict itself, to self-emancipate by picking up the promise in particular, but not only, of Dunmore's proclamation for freedom by joining with the British forces themselves. And it's very important for us to remember that during the course of the conflict, that was a perfectly rational decision to make. And certainly in the longer perspective of the 19th century, if you were an enslaved person, your chances of being freed were going to be greater in the British Empire by the 1830s than they were within the United States itself by the 1860s as a result of a cataclysmic conflict, which, if it had gone the other way, would have continued with enslavement. So it's perfectly rational to imagine the British would give that greater promise there. And then if we're thinking towards the end of the conflict itself, of those refugees, those loyalist refugees who leave, again, calculations would probably say it's about 60,000 white loyalists plus 15,000 black enslaved persons whom they take with them, particularly to Nova Scotia, and then a breakaway group who go to Sierra Leone. If we calculate that in terms of the population of the colonies at that period, that's 1/40th of the population, equivalent to roughly 7.5 to 8 million people in the United States today. This is much larger on a global scale than the parallel movement of emigre royalist refugees from the French Revolution, for instance. And this reconsideration of the deep divisions, the very large numbers, and the rational calculations which loyalists across the spectrum took, I think, has been one of the most salutary movements within American revolutionary historiography, mostly led by historians of Britain, it must be said, rather than self-identified US historians or colonial American historians, really again to erase the patriot narrative, which has pushed the loyalists to one side, seen them as recidivists or only as conservatives or reactionaries, but actually to see the range of motivations for white and black loyalists alike, as well as the extraordinarily large numbers on a comparative global scale of those who not only remained as loyalists even in an independent United States, but actually left to form new lives across the world after 1783.
Thanks, David. Steve, can you give us some sense of your own take on loyalism, the roots of loyalism?
Yeah, I mean, again, I want to, I mean, the first thing I want to say is the extraordinarily significant percentage of loyalists, whether it's 15 or 20%, it's extremely high. And I think one should think about this as something equivalent to what happened in the partition of India and Pakistan in the 20th century, right? Everybody sort of thinks of that as something, a cataclysmic event, a shifting of populations, a shifting of wealth, a dividing of peoples, and see this as, hugely divisive. The numbers are comparable in North America in the 18th century, and I think that will be a very useful frame of reference. And as David said, this is perhaps larger than what happened, the amount of royalist emigres during the French Revolution. And I think that that really does sort of frame things and suggest the degree to which this is an imperial civil war. I guess I would simply add, I think what Megan has said and what David has said is extremely important, but I would add a couple of things. One is, I think it's important to realize that there were a significant number of indigenous loyalists, right? That there was a significant number of, especially members of the Six Nations, who believed that their interests, both the protection of their hunting grounds and their territory, would be better served by remaining within the British Empire than joining with the American cause, which is why they're singled out in the Declaration of Independence for a certain amount of vituperative abuse. That is to say, and I think there really was a significant amount of Native American loyalism, and also a movement among some of the Six Nations, at least their property northward, even if they didn't actually physically. So that's another important element to put alongside those who hope for emancipation. But another element that I want to emphasize also is another element of loyalism was a profound, how does one say, the skepticism about the kind of new values that they saw were growing up within the British Empire that were urban. David talked about the sort of urbanization of the empire, but there was an increasing critique of these kind of urbanization, commercial values, the idea that older ties didn't matter. And you see this obviously in Governor Hutchinson's statements, in his own autobiographical stuff in Massachusetts, but it does seem to be that this was broadly pervasive. And I think it's important to realize this critique of urban society, this notion that what was going wrong in North America, especially on the eastern seaboard, was that it was being dominated by these cities, New York, Boston, Charleston, Philadelphia, and that these were importing new values, commercial values, which were also being critiqued by Lord North and his followers in Britain as, the sort of the bad urban values. And it's important to realize that this had an afterlife, that this perspective of loyalism had an afterlife, and it's there. It had an afterlife in the founding of New South Wales. So a lot of the documents around the founding of New South Wales in 1788 were saying, look, the mistake that we made in North America was to allow cities to grow. And that led to this kind of new sensibility. So what we're going to do is we're going to give, former convicts small parcels of land, which would allow them to compel them in some ways not to congregate in cities. Now, of course, this failed, right? The immediate creation of New South Wales involved the development of the city of Sydney, but that was the idea, and that was sort of deeply informed by loyalist perspectives in Britain. Loyalists were very deeply involved in American loyalists were deeply involved in the founding of New South Wales. So I think that there's this other anti-urban element which went into a perspective of loyalism as well. But I think it's also right. What David said and what Megan said. There were also loyalists who were simply people who were committed to a federal version of empire. And the best example of this is Governor Wentworth of New Hampshire, who was bitterly critical of the Stamp Act, fairly critical of the Townsend duties, but in 1775 decided, he couldn't break with the British Empire, and he, of course, ends his life as the governor of Nova Scotia, and involved in welcoming loyalists to Nova Scotia.
Great, thanks, Steve. I want to, having considered ideology, identity, politics, think about the character of the violent conflict itself. Because, as David has mentioned, there were perceptions at the time. People at the time thought of this war as a civil one, as a fraternal conflict, either as a fight among Americans, among members of a new nation, or as between fellow British subjects. And I wonder, how far does that sense that this is a civil war influence how the war itself is fought and waged? David, if I could start with you.
Well, I'll put one very important context on the table, which I think you've already hinted at, Eamonn, which is a reconceptualization of civil war in legal terms in this period. The Bible of the so-called law of nations, what we would now call international law of this period, is written by a Swiss jurist called Emma de Vattel in the late 1750s and immediately translated into English. It's the only identifiable book which was on the desk of the drafters of the Declaration of Independence, which I think is not irrelevant to the fact that he redefined civil war in the 1750s in relation to internal rebellion. His new definition of civil war at that point was that any polity in which a rebellious group had justice on their side, for example, against a tyrant, would, over the course of their conflict, develop into two nations. Having developed into two nations, it could then be the possibility for external powers to intervene on either side of such a conflict, justifiably and legitimately under Vattel's conception of the law of nations, and that a civil war could therefore be transformed into an international war under the contemporary law of nations. That's in the 1750s. That book becomes the single most influential legal text across the world until the 1830s, especially, but not only in revolutionary context. And I think that radical redefinition of what might otherwise have been seen as rebellion as civil war, now deemed to be war under the laws of war, provides a remarkably novel context. It's a context which allows us idiomatically to use contemporary language of the American Revolution, not called as such until later in the 1770s, as a civil war, but also to see the divisiveness within the empire, as well as within individual colonies as a civil war, but also, crucially, to put it into a diplomatic context in which a declaration of independence becomes a call for the other powers of the earth to intervene on behalf of a population in rebellion, certainly in the conception of the British ministry and crown, on their side to support them. And so the Declaration of Independence does what it says on the tin. It declares independence in language drawn from Vattel, who makes independence itself a synonym for autonomous sovereignty in this period, and thereby opens up legitimately under the law of nations support for the American colonists by, for example, France, as they come on board in early 1778. So I think this is very important redefinition of civil war under the law of nations, transforming the laws of war. No doubt Megan and Steve can talk more about how the conflict itself was fought under the changing laws of war in that period. But I wanted to put that bigger frame around the more specific discussions of how the war itself was fought.
Thank you, David. If I can come to you, Megan, tell us a bit about how this idea of the conflict as a civil war shaped how the war was fought.
So as a non-military historian, I actually feel out of my depth. So I don't think I can really do much to add any shape really beyond what David has already so eloquently done. But I think maybe I would just sort of reemphasize the extent to which there was othering during the pre-war years. As I said before, it was a sort of a slow and steady campaign. But I think, in some aspects, in terms of the actual conditions of the war, there was, I guess, sort of like a built-in separation due to this sort of othering and even a sense of patriotic othering within the American colonies. So yeah, I've put a lot of thought into this and I still don't know that I have an answer. I can say that it certainly influenced attitudes towards the war, but I don't know in terms of how the war itself was fought on like, a day-to-day basis. So I'm interested to see Steve's take on this for sure.
Yeah, well, I think let's move to Steve. I think something that Civil War scholars would say is, often they're involving reprisals, pretty vicious reprisals, and we see plenty of that, unfortunately, in the American Revolutionary era, and also a battle for hearts and minds. And it's interesting, even though the British Army does much at times to alienate local populations, how the generals or in the standing orders of regiments are saying, this is a battle for the hearts and minds of Americans. We need to behave. We need to get people on side and harness loyalist support, rather than thinking this is an enemy territory that we're occupying. It was very much we need to get this back within the empire. Steve, give us a sense of how the war is fought and maybe how that tracks with civil wars, or maybe how it doesn't fit within a civil war model.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna sort of shift the way of thinking about. I mean, I'm not a military historian, but I am quite interested in the military logistics of the American conflict, and I think it's really important to place this. Again, this is where thinking about it as an imperial civil war really helps us, right? Famously, the battles ended with, the American victory at the Battle of Yorktown. And the American victory at the Battle of Yorktown happened because the French fleet was able to isolate Cornwallis's army in Virginia, right? I mean, very famously. Now, why did this happen? Why did this happen? It's extremely puzzling, right, at some level, because while the French had been investing in building up their navy after their huge naval defeats in the 7 Years' War, the British still had a superior navy, and they actually won most naval conflicts when they came head to head. So why was the British Army isolated? Well, the explanation has to do with the fact that during the time of the American Revolutionary War, between 1775 and 1780, Britain quadrupled the number of ships stationed in South Asia, in India, right? So they shifted the Navy, which had been stationed in the Caribbean and in North America, to the Indian frontier, because this was an imperial civil war. They also they refused to move ships, and they moved increasing numbers of ships into the Caribbean away from the eastern seaboard. Now, why was that? Because from the political economic perspective of Lord North, the really valuable territories were not the 13 colonies that became independent, but India. And we know from North's own calculations, he thought that India could, within a few years, generate 4 million pounds of revenue per year to pay down the debt. Now, it turned out to be wrong, but that was the assumption. And the assumption was that still the sugar plantations in the Caribbean were providing more revenue to possibly pay down the debt. So if you had to choose, you were going to station your navy in the Caribbean and in India. And this also explains why, despite how controversial it was to sort of provide military support for North America in the parliaments of 1778, 1779, we know that there were hot debates about this. And they did spend more money, much more money than the opposition, than certainly the Duke of Richmond or the Earl of Rockingham or Edmund Burke, for that matter, thought they should be spending. But it was much less money than somebody like the Secretary of War, or the First Lord of the Admiralty thought they should be spending on North America. Because they were dealing with a budget where they had to deploy money to fight the other parts of the Imperial Civil War, and indeed. It was this notion of redeploying troops which created the opportunity and the development for the rise of the volunteers in Ireland, precisely because Britain had been forced to redeploy the troops that had been barracked in Ireland to North America, leaving it vulnerable to a French invasion, which gave the volunteers a pretext that they were going to be defending Ireland. So I guess one of the things that I would say, I mean, I think what David has talked about the redefinition of the legal context is extremely important for understanding what's going on. But I think it's equally important to understand that this was a war which was being fought not just in the 13 colonies, but being fought on a global scale. And British military defeat in North America happened in part because Britain didn't feel, I mean, certainly by 1779, didn't feel like it could come out victorious on all fronts, and made choices which ended up being decisive about what parts of the empire to defend and what parts of the empire not to defend. And so I think I think this sort of Civil War framing helps us to understand precisely how the war was fought.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Steve. You've brought in the global dimension, which, as you say, is incredibly important to understanding the conflict and how it plays out. And I want to shift in our final question to think about that wider story, because understandably, there's a focus on the 13 colonies, the ones which declared independence. But George III's authority extended far beyond that to, say, French Canada, to the Caribbean, to Ireland, to much further afield as well. And I think I want to shift now to the dogs that didn't bark, as it were, because we've been mentioning obliquely some of the things that did go on in Ireland, some of the protests that took place over the Stamp Act, and other imperial initiatives before the American Revolution in places that didn't ultimately join with the 13 colonies. I mean, David, can you tell us a little bit about how some of these other parts of the British Empire responded both to the imperial crisis of the 1760s and 70s, these debates over governance and taxation, and why they, in some cases, didn't join with the American Revolution or respond in the way that the Patriots, say, in the case of Canada, had hoped they would?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just on the back of Steve's last point, it's very important to say that this global context is not something that we can see, but contemporaries could not see. It's not a frame that we're imposing with our greater knowledge 250 years later. It's something that was very evident to contemporaries as well. So read the various emissions from the Continental Congress in their attempts, for example, to bring Jamaica into the Continental Congress, to bring Quebec and other parts of the West Indies, the British Caribbean, into their councils. They are talking in those documents repeatedly and cumulatively about a global conspiracy of tyranny throughout the empire being projected initially by ministers and parliament. It's only with the Declaration of Independence that the king becomes the central figure, as we've talked about before. But the sense of a global conspiracy, which is taking place in North America, in the Caribbean, in South Asia, as the larger frame for the actions of even the representatives of 13 colonies, is very important to keep in mind. So why is that campaign not successful in drawing together all the parts of Britain's empire, all of George III's subjects into what becomes the revolutionary cause that leads to the splitting off of the 13 colonies? Well, we can take a couple of examples going all the way back, as Megan and Steve have reminded us, to the Stamp Act crisis, for instance. In the stamp duties are meant to apply to all of the colonies, but unequally to different colonies in the British Americas. So Quebec is largely exempted from the Stamp Act. It doesn't mean there isn't some resistance to the Stamp Act in Quebec. In the British Caribbean, there is much more resistance. In some cases, there are more pamphlets, more resolutions and debates in the colonial assemblies in parts of the West Indies than there are in some parts of the mainland in the 1760s, not least because of, for example, the accelerating property transfers after the 7 Years' War within the Caribbean islands, leading to a glut of paper on which stamps had to be impressed, for instance. So there are those very different determinations. If we think in particular, just for the moment, about the British Caribbean islands, something that's been shown very persuasively and very effectively by our colleague André O'Shaughnessy is the fear of slave rebellion for the minority, very small minority white population in most of the islands, that ultimately they see their self-interest as aligned with the British state, that naval protection that Steve was just talking about, the British move some of their naval protection away from Philadelphia to the Caribbean at a crucial moment, leaving parts of the eastern seaboard exposed, precisely as Steve has said, because they know that there are greater profits ultimately to be made from the Caribbean, but also because of lobbying by those from the West India lobby in London itself, who say, look, we need your military protection. We need redcoats here. You could still see the barracks in Jamaica. We need naval protection because we're afraid that we're going to have a conflagration on our plantations of uprisings by the enslaved population. So that's the self-interest determinant, a major self-interest determinant, which means that the West Indies don't join, for instance. There are, I won't talk about Ireland because I know Steve has been doing a lot of research on that recently as well. But if we pull out the picture and think about the larger consequences of the loyalist diaspora in particular, as we're at the end of the story, what happens when these tens of thousands of people, white and their enslaved persons they take with them, move around the world. They reshape the empire from Nova Scotia to the Bahamas to Sierra Leone to New South Wales. The consequences of this are going to be genuinely global in creating what we might even call a counter-revolutionary empire in the 1780s, 1790s, and all the way up to the present. We might even see the framing of President Trump's desire to absorb Canada into the US as the 51st state, or a congeries of states, as the last act of the American Revolution to overcome that loyalist, non-loyalist divide. So the context can continue right down to the present.
Thank you very much, David. Megan, if I can come over to you. How far are the types of political organization resistance to imperial initiatives echoed in other parts of the British Empire?
So I found this question really interesting because I was kind of reminded of the quote we often see from John Adams, where he says, a history of the military operations of the war years itself is not a reflection of the broader American Revolution. He talks about it as being something that happened in the hearts and minds of Americans. And I think I would extend his quote further to, say we do need to zoom out and look at what was happening within the broader empire here. And yeah, sort of, I guess to echo what David has said, I think it's absolutely fair to say that throughout the empire, as you're sort of zooming out to look at the bigger picture and then zooming in to try to capture this personal, individual, or even like just more localized interest, I think it's absolutely fair to say that throughout the empire, there was sympathy with the patriot cause. But it did certainly have to be quite a specific determination. There's so many moving parts to consider, so I don't want to make these like massive sort of sweeping generalizations. But I mean, even from the British side, it came to a point where it's like, how far do we go? Where do we draw the line in this contest? I think it's in 1774, King George says to Lord North, we're kind of reaching a point where we either have to master these people altogether or just let them go. And yeah, I think for folks throughout the broader empire, it certainly got to a point where it's like, we need to make a decision now because things are getting quite serious. So, yeah, I mean, certainly in the Caribbean and other parts of the empire, there were concerns about parliamentary overreach. Other parts of the empire had their own legislatures as well, and they, wanted to struggle for their own autonomy. But again, there's so many other interests to consider that it's hard to put a blanket kind of statement on how everybody was responding to it.
Great. Well, thanks. To finish us off, I think we'll move to Steve, who can maybe drill down, especially on the case of Ireland, how Ireland fits into this story, both what Americans think of what's going on in Ireland and how the Irish use this moment or see this moment as a chance to make changes that might favor them, at least from the Anglo-Irish perspective. Tell us, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with Ireland, but I do want to say something briefly about Nova Scotia and Bengal as well. So let me start with Ireland. Yeah, I mean, I think in the Irish case, there have been long-term discontents about the kind of economic treatment of Ireland, especially since the 1760s. That Ireland had gone through a sort of a boom period after the 1730s, but then during Lord Townsend's Lord Lieutenancy or Viceroyalty, things didn't work out so well, and there was increasing arguments in Ireland for free trade. This was the argument that was being enunciated, that there was need for free trade for Ireland to be able to trade freely with the empire, and of course this played into both the interests in Northern Ireland of linen manufacturers in Northern Ireland, but also with a more pastoral interest, especially in places like Munster, which were exporting huge quantities of butter, beef, tallow, etc., both to North America and the West Indies, and they were being restricted in unfair ways. But things really came to a head when the British government felt the necessity, because of the war, to transfer the troops that barracked in Ireland to North America, which led Ireland left Ireland undefended against a rumored French invasion, which led all of these sorts of people, these sort of volunteers, to literally volunteer to take up arms to defend Ireland. And what's interesting about the volunteers is normally treated in Irish historiography that this was a Protestant movement because this is how it was remembered in the 20th century. But actually in the 18th century, what was remarkable about the volunteers is that it includes significant number of Catholics. And we know this by going through the muster books. Especially in places like Limerick, for example. It's very clear that it was involved, yes, a Protestant majority, but a significant sort of Catholic participation. And they argued increasingly for free trade. When Lord North's government was very reluctant and ultimately concedes a lessening of commercial restrictions, they then argue, look, there needs to be a revising of the constitutional arrangements because Lord North said this was a temporary expedient, and he used the word expedient. They said, well, if it's only an expedient, when the American Revolutionary War is going to be over, we're not going to have this free trade, and we're going to be back to where they were. So they argued for constitutional reform, along the lines of creating a federation. That the idea was that the empire needed to be understood as a federation. Ireland needed to be given full legislative independence, and they were granted this in Grattan's Parliament. Now, this ultimately gets undermined in the later 1780s, but the story with the American Revolution is that, and they constantly referred to the complaints that the Americans had made about restrictions on trade as being exactly parallel to their own. So John Healy Hutchinson, who was no radical, who was the provost of Trinity College Dublin, made exactly this parallel. This is exactly the claims that the Americans had been making, especially he pointed to the Fairfax Resolves from Fairfax County, Virginia, as an example of exactly these arguments. So there was definite involvement on both sides, and so Ireland was going the direction of America, and in fact, a lot of people sort of understood this. But what Ireland demanded, and ultimately was legislative independence, commercial independence, but not separation for the empire. And it was the fact that Shelburne's government, after the fall of Lord North's government, actually conceded something along those lines, which I think prevented calls for further independence, although that was very much in the air in 1780 to 1782, 1783. So that's the Irish story. So in other words, it's the fall of Lord North's government, I think, that was instrumental in keeping Ireland to be part of the empire. But it's important to realize that if you read the Halifax Gazette from Nova Scotia in the 1770s, it was every bit as radical as the Pennsylvania Gazette, Benjamin Franklin's newspaper. It made exactly the same sorts of complaints. And indeed, at the beginning of the in 1775, after after the shots were fired in Lexington and Concord, there was significant Nova Scotian support for the Americans. And why didn't Nova Scotia become the 14th state? The answer is because they wanted to join the American cause, and the Second Continental Congress said, yes, we're very happy, and we'll pay you. we'll pay you with our paper money. But the paper money didn't have any backing, and it meant that the troops, the Nova Scotian troops, were being paid with stuff that was worth absolutely nothing, and they were slaughtered by the British on the battlefield because they couldn't buy ammunition. And that, I mean, it was the failure of the Second Continental Congress to find a stable currency in 1775 to 1777, which meant it was impossible for Nova Scotia to do what it intended to do. And it's clear that the Second Continental Congress hoped to welcome them with open arms. They just didn't have a means of paying them. So I think that indicates how much this was a sort of a global phenomenon. But I also want to call your attention to Hickey's Calcutta Gazette, published in 1780 and 1781. It enunciated all of the concerns of the Americans and the Irish. Hickey himself was Irish, and reported on the developments in the Caribbean, where he overestimated, I think, the willingness of some planters to join the American cause. But nevertheless, he reported on this. He talked about Irish sympathy for the American cause, and he wrote sympathetically and described the concerns of what had happened in North America, which led ultimately to the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And he pointed out that Warren Hastings' role of Governor General was exactly parallel to what General Gates had done in North America. And he argued that Calcutta was becoming the new New York, and that is to say, a new militarized area, and thought that the only possibility to keep India within the British Empire would be to get rid of the Governor General, in this case Warren Hastings, and to radically reform India. Now, of course, we know this didn't happen, but what did happen was a significant debate in the British Parliament in the late 1770s and 1780s, which ultimately involved two competing India Acts: Fox India Bill, which was failed, which would have moved in a direction of something like an imperial federation, and Pitt's India Act, which was adopted in 1784, which created a board of control and amped up the level of militarization and centralization that Hickey had been complaining about. Of course, by this point, Hickey was dead. But it's important to realize that there was a very similar debate going on in India as was going on in North America.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Well, this draws to a close our discussion. Thanks so much for a very enlightening conversation. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today, David, Steve, and Megan. Thank you so much. And thanks as well to the audience for tuning in. If you enjoyed this roundtable discussion, please do keep an eye out for our next installment, asking the question of why did Britain lose the American War of Independence, which will be appearing on the National Army Museum's YouTube channel in due course. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yep.